Hey everyone! Today, we're going back in time to one of the most dramatic and devastating moments in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople, fought on August 9, 378 CE. This wasn't just any battle, it was a catastrophic loss for Rome, leaving over 10,000 soldiers dead and shaking the empire to its core. To give you some perspective, this defeat ranks right up there with legendary Roman disasters, like the battles of Cannae and Carrhae. The stage was set with two very different leaders on opposing sides. On one hand, we had the Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths, led by the shrewd and determined chieftain Fritigern. On the other, there was Valens, the Roman emperor. Valens wasn't exactly loved by his people. He was seen as vain and desperate for glory. And that thirst for recognition would lead to one of Rome's darkest days. Now, let's rewind a bit. The trouble between the Romans and the Goths started off in a way that seemed manageable. Around 376 CE, the nomadic Huns were sweeping across Asia, forcing the Visigoths, over 200,000 of them, to flee toward the Roman Empire. They crossed the Danube River and settled in Thrace, with the Romans agreeing to let them stay as long as they provided soldiers and gave up their weapons. Sounds fair, right? Well, not really. Roman commanders soon made even harsher demands, like enslaving Gothic children and giving them barely enough food to survive. It wasn't long before the Goths had had enough. Starving and desperate, they rebelled. What followed was chaos. Gothic raids spread across the countryside, and after surviving an assassination attempt, Fritigern led his forces into open conflict against the Romans. Battles at Adrianople in 376, and the Battle of the Willows in 377, showed just how tough the Goths had become, and the Romans were struggling to contain them. Emperor Valens, who had been busy fighting the Persians in the east, was forced to return to face this growing threat. By the time the Goths neared Constantinople, the Roman capital in the east, Valens knew he had to act. But here's where it all went wrong. Valens didn't wait for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian, who was leading Roman forces in the west. Gratian was young, yes, but he was already proving himself to be a capable leader. Valens, however, was consumed with envy. He didn't want to share any credit for what he saw as a sure victory, so he ignored advice and marched straight into battle. To make matters worse, his scouts told him the Gothic army was much smaller than it actually was. They estimated about 10,000 fighters, but what they didn't know was that an additional force of Gothic cavalry, another 10,000, was out foraging and would return soon. Valens thought he had the upper hand, but he was walking into a trap. Even as the Goths tried to negotiate peace the night before the battle, Valens refused. Some historians believe the Gothic peace offers were never genuine and were only meant to stall for time until reinforcements could arrive. And they might have been right. By the time the Romans prepared for battle, the sun was blazing, the soldiers were exhausted from their march, and the Gothic cavalry had returned. And the morning of August 9th was a grim one for the Roman forces. Leaving their supplies behind, the Roman army set out from camp to face the Goths, who had fortified their position with a wagon circle. This wasn't just a defensive formation, it was also a makeshift shelter for their women, children, and elders, along with their supplies. As the Roman soldiers finally approached the Gothic position, exhausted from their march under the scorching sun, they saw the wagon circle arranged in an imposing formation. The Goths weren't just sitting idly. They had taken up a strong defensive spot along a nearby ridge. Their infantry and archers were in place, ready for what was coming. Meanwhile, the Romans prepared for battle as best they could. Their forces were drawn into two lines, heavy infantry at the center, with skirmishers ahead of them, and cavalry on the flanks. But here's the thing, Roman cavalry at this point was still a weak link in their military structure. They were unpredictable and made up only about a quarter of their forces. Before the battle even fully began, two Roman cavalry units decided to act on their own, attacking without orders. This move backfired spectacularly, and they were quickly pushed back. It was a chaotic start, and things only got worse from there. The Romans launched their left wing into an attack, and at first it seemed like they were making progress, pushing the Goths back toward their wagon circle. But then, the unexpected happened. Reinforcements arrived. The Greutungi cavalry, along with Huns and Alans, joined the Gothic side, turning the tide of the battle. The Roman left wing, caught off guard and unsupported, was overwhelmed and crushed. The surviving soldiers fled, leaving the rest of the Roman army vulnerable. At this point, the Romans were in complete disarray. The Gothic forces on the ridge took full advantage, charging down and hitting the Roman infantry from the front and the sides. The Roman soldiers, already exhausted and dehydrated, were packed together so tightly that they could barely move, let alone fight effectively. The chaos on the battlefield was horrifying. Clouds of dust blocked out the sun, and arrows rained down on the Romans, striking them from all sides. Ammianus Marcellinus, one of the key historians of the time, painted a gruesome picture. The Romans, unable to defend themselves, were trampled underfoot, and the battlefield turned into a nightmarish scene of blood and death. Even the Emperor Valens found himself with only a small group of men left by his side. Despite their desperate attempts to hold their ground, they were overwhelmed. The details of Valens' death are murky. Some say he was wounded by an arrow and carried to a nearby farmhouse, where the Goths later burned him alive along with the building. What's clear is that Valens didn't survive, and neither did the majority of his army. 2/3 of the Roman forces were wiped out that day. Now, looking back at why the Romans suffered such a catastrophic defeat, several reasons stand out. First, the morale of the Roman army was already low. They were exhausted, hungry, and dehydrated by the time they reached the battlefield. Second, poor scouting left Valens completely unaware of the reinforcements the Goths had waiting. And finally, the Roman cavalry's poor planning and execution left their left flank exposed, which the Goths exploited to devastating effect. In the end, Valens' desire for glory cost him everything. Had he waited for his nephew Gratian to arrive with reinforcements, things might have gone differently. But his impatience and overconfidence led to disaster. The Battle of Adrianople was more than just a loss. It was a turning point that revealed cracks in the Roman military system and signaled the beginning of the end for the empire in the west. While the Goths couldn't fully capitalize on their victory, the damage was done. The Gothic War dragged on, and eventually, in 382 CE, a truce was struck, granting the Goths land in exchange for service in the Roman army. But the defeat at Adrianople lingered in history as a grim reminder of Rome's vulnerability, setting the stage for future invasions and, ultimately, the empire's fall in the West.